Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgins.
Well, hello, my name is Ed Hudgins, and I'm so glad that you are joining us for this first session of Conversations in Color. And we have some brilliant people with me here today that I'm going to introduce to you here in a moment. But first, just a little about myself. Again, my name is Ed. I have a project called Tome Swab. It's a blog. It's a radio show, but really it's an effort to help us all experience a deeper level of peace, or shalom, if you will. I also work with Converge Radio on the Community Advisory Board, and more importantly, I am a husband to Charlotte and daddy to Josh. So I am not in this alone. I've got some great people. I'm going to introduce you to our troublemaker at large here in just a moment, my partner in crime. But before I do that, just want to mention a little bit about what this is. So we really... what we want to do with Conversations in Color is we want to provide a space for us to be able to talk about hard stuff, dealing with race issues, lean into some hard questions, do so in a respectful manner, and try to build some bridges and better educate ourselves about things that we need to be thinking about. And as we have these conversations, we have three pillars that we really want to kind of maintain as a part of the conversation. One is humanity, meaning we want to be loving toward one another as human beings and respect humanity in general. Also, this is totally nonpartisan. There's no political aspect to this. I can tell you that my partner in crime, Dr. Selika here, who I'll introduce in a moment, she and I both really hate both political parties. So we are equal opportunity offenders when it comes to politics. Honesty is one of our pillars. We want to be authentic with each other. We want to ask hard questions. We want to talk about difficult stuff together. And then humility, which is a really important cornerstone. Just recognizing that as human beings, we're all limited and frail, and we don't see the full picture on anything as much as we might think we do at times. So with that in mind, that's how we want to kind of frame up our conversations. And so I want to, at this point, introduce my partner in crime, since I've alluded to her a couple different times now. She is a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Eau Claire. She teaches history. She has like 75 different degrees. She's brilliant, and she is my partner in crime and my fellow troublemaker. Welcome, Dr. Selika Ducksworth-Lawton. So is there anything that you would like to say as we kind of welcome everybody into this conversation?
We have enough ideas to do this well into next year. There are people who have asked us to do this. I am the president of Uniting Bridges here in Eau Claire, and our organization builds bridges across race, across class, across gender, across sexuality. And the biggest thing for us is to have these nonpartisan, deep conversations where people feel that they can ask questions and will not be vilified, because we want to see one Eau Claire, one Chippewa Valley, one Wisconsin, and one world. So we felt that this series will help us to get these topics out there, to get some good information out there, but especially to get neighbors talking to neighbors and talking among ourselves so that we can work towards peace. And we want peace in this time of trouble and strain.
So, Selika, I had other things I was going to say about you, and I was introducing you, but I got caught up in the troublemaking aspect, since that seems to be where we are really connected. But I want to introduce everybody to our great panelists this week, kicking it off this first session. We're excited to have these three. We've got Jaylin Carlson here, who she's a recent graduate from UW-Madison. She is the founder of the EC Justice League, has been very active in the community with some of the more recent civil rights things that we have been focused on. So welcome, Jaylin.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're gonna humanize these people, because you guys are all brilliant. And so I'm going to give you each a question that you have to answer, all right? If you could be any flavor of ice cream that you wanted to be, if you could be that flavor, not eat it, what flavor would it be?
Ooh. Man, I think I would be Blue Moon because it's like very perplexing and interesting and bright.
Sweet.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with that.
All right. That question was probably much more existential than I ever expected it to be. All right. And we've got Dr. Roderick Jones, who is a professor also at the university, focusing on special ed and has years of experience teaching as an educator. Welcome, Dr. Jones. Welcome. I'm going to call you Rod because we talked about that. I'm going to call you Rod.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you.
So I got to give you a question.
Go for it.
Who is your favorite South Florida bull of all time?
Good question.
You can say you because you are a South Florida bull.
Well, you know what? Let's go with the obvious then, Ed. Thank you. Me.
Perfect. I would agree with you on that one. I'm with you. All right.
Appreciate the softball.
And then we have Dr. Jerry Worley here, who is also a professor at the university, and he focuses on education, social justice issues. I know he has done some work with Native American studies as well. Welcome, Dr. Worley. Welcome,
Thank
Jerry.
you.
So, for you, I could say who's the most famous alum from Southern Mississippi, but I think we kind of know who that is probably. He's a little bit of a legend up here, Mr. Favre.
Yeah.
If you were going to be a professional wrestler, what would your name be?
That's not a softball, man. That's
No, but you can make up anything and ain't nobody gonna know any difference.
right. Let's go after my home state, Big Sky.
Big Sky. Oh, that's
Big Sky.
nice.
Okay.
That's well done right there.
Thank you.
Good job. All right. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start leaning in on some of the things we want to talk about. So we're talking today about navigating race and racism with children. And I just want to put it out there, like, this would be a dumb question for me to actually ask because I have a kid. But why is this important? Why is it important that we talk about race and racism with our children? And I'll throw it out there. Dr. Jones, Rod, you look like you're ready to answer, so let's jump in with it.
Let's go for it. So I think, if you think about kids, right, the different ages, and I'm just going to talk about early childhood, for example, because I'm thinking about my wife right now. She's an early childhood professor. At that age, they're dealing with a lot of shame and guilt developmentally. And I think it's important for kids to understand that sense of unknowingness, if you will, about their identity as it relates to how they, interrelate with people of different races, different dialogues that occur within the context of their being, their world. It's important that we help them understand that it is okay to be different, right? And help them navigate those conversations in those spaces. I think oftentimes we, out of a sense of love and care, we don't want to have those tender conversations with our babies, so to speak, because we don't want them to feel that sense of shame, right, and that sense of guilt. But developmentally, they're already dealing with it, right? And it's important that we understand that and help them navigate those terrains. And I'll come back to other pieces a little bit later, but I think just starting there is an important launching pad.
So kind of recognizing that as they're developing, there are already these kind of insecurities at play, and like it's a natural thing to talk about. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
As early as 4 is where my children started talking about race and coming home and saying so-and-so called me this, or so-and-so said something. For us not to validate that is going to cause them pain. It causes them to shut down.
Right.
Because I've had other kids sit in my kitchen and ask us the questions they really wish they were able to ask their parents. Because it's there. We want to think that the kids aren't noticing it and they aren't picking up the craziness that's on TV, etc.
Absolutely.
But it's there. I will caution you, never use that ice cream trick, though. I did tell my 4-year-old, I think it was my son and his friends, that were all just like ice cream, just different flavors. And of course, one bit the other within 30 seconds, and that was the end of that. So whoever suggested using ice cream to explain racial difference, that was a backfire. That was a pretty epic backfire. Don't do that.
I should interject really quickly that anybody who's listening in, if you're listening on Converge, but really you need to be a part of the chat or a part of the live stream on Pablo's website. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat function in there, and we will be going through those and adding those to our discussion as we go through. I was remiss in not mentioning that earlier. I apologize. Jaylin, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I would just say, like, kind of to piggyback off what you're saying about maybe not using the ice cream trick. I think for me, just honesty is great. And I think, like what you said, kids are very intelligent. They feel everything very deeply, and they also feel when you're being honest. So I think, like, for me, and that's one thing that I was really appreciative that my, mom always did with me, was she was just honest about what everything was and what it meant, and kind of left me to make sense of it as well, of like, this is the reality. So I appreciated that. And then I think the second thing of why this is important is just because at the end of the day, we live in this country that's prided on being this melting pot of all these different backgrounds, all these different, ethnicities, cultures. So I think by not talking about it with your kids is doing them a disservice, and not giving them the tools that they're going to need to interact with their fellow humans. And in addition to that, I would just say that they're going to probably, like Selika said, I ran into these issues. I remember at 5 having to ask my mom what the N-word was because I had been called it. And so I think they're going to run into these issues in the world, and they're going to have these conversations with people. And I think it's probably great to have that first conversation with someone who they trust and who they know, and that it can come from your mouth and maybe not someone else's. So that you can have those conversations with your kid before maybe other people do, and give them the tools to actually deal with it when it happens, because it will.
And if you don't give them the tools, they wind up in my African American history class. But they also wind up in pain. They really wind up in some pain.
Right.
Absolutely.
And we have to process that pain, because if people pretend that racism doesn't exist and then they hit it, they don't have the tools to process it, and they're going to think something's wrong with them. Sure. And not understand, no, this is this other person's problem. And they will keep hitting their head on that wall until they either self-destruct or they get the tools somewhere. So this is really important, whether we're talking about why people are acting in a racist way, or what are these historical reasons, or what is this history? And why should we teach this history, and why should they learn it? Because a lot of kids right now are looking at what's happening on the TV, especially when The Watchmen came out. And if they're in middle school or above, they're saying, why weren't we taught this history? I have a 13-year-old who said, why wasn't I taught that Harriet Tubman did a Kambachi raid? She was the first woman general. She wasn't just the first black woman, she was the first woman. And I'm looking at her, and I have to come up with an answer that is tactful enough not to get me in trouble with the Eau Claire school district, but is also honest. And I think that is a part of the problem that we have, both as the parents and as educators. Because we have to be tactful too. There are people out there these kids are going to interact with, and they have very different ideas from the parents about people's worth, and the kids need to be prepared for that.
So I think it's important that at some point in our discussion we really talk about schools a little bit and what the responsibility of schools in this regard. But let's kind of, with the question that we started out with here, speaking from, a white person's perspective, with whiteism being like the center of our universe. What is it? Why should I talk to, if I have a white kid, why should I talk about race with my kid because, you know, like they're white, and that's a loaded question intentionally.
I'm going to pass it to them.
There are burgeoning thoughts over here, and I'm.
Oh, yeah, it's pretty deep.
I'm going to let that one settle, but I'd like to answer your first question. And
Yeah,
if
please.
you don't mind.
Oh, please.
And we'll get back to that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I just think that why we have a lot of anger out there is because we humans have a basic psychological need of love or belonging, respect. And, you know, when I served in the military, I met a lot of people of color, and the angriest were African Americans back in the 1970s. And as I go through my studies and I position that, and I teach social studies education, I just think it's important that all humans can socially relate to something in society first, so then they can connect and maybe become civically engaged, right? So I think that's why we should study race.
Gotcha.
And
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off.
oh, that's okay.
I have to cut you
I
off.
just want to throw that in. And so even myself, when I feel left out, or if I don't feel like I don't belong, then I become angry, and I feel like I'm not part of society. So I'd just like to throw that in.
No, that's. Thank you.
But I'm not ready to answer that second question. So I'm going to hold off on that one for a while.
Y'all still percolating over there?
Well, you know, it is a pretty profound question.
big question.
It's a huge question, you know.
Because there's a lot of layers to that, right?
Right. It's a lot of contextualization and rhizomatic structures, right, that are embedded in that notion. But I think to kind of keep it simple, it's just, you know, I would suggest that if you are a white parent, right, who want their child to understand the importance of the human condition, so to speak, more broadly, right, that it's not just one hegemonic way of looking at the world, one, you know, racial superior way of looking at the world, whereby everybody else is inferior and subjugated to this one, you know, way of seeing, being, knowing, right? Whiteness has this sense of idea of feeling as though it's ubiquitous, right? It's the only way through which we are to experience the world. And I think you want kids to understand that that is not okay. It is not okay. In fact, I think that we do kids a disservice if we don't educate them and inform them, right, of this human condition that we call variance, right? People with a multiplicity of cultures, with a multiplicity of voices, ethnicities, languages. It is important for kids to understand that one does not trump the other, right? And so I think, you know, the earlier that we teach kids these orientations, the better for them, the better for our world.
Right. So really, it's going to be dependent upon the parents' perspective on how they see the world and seeing the value in seeing it from a different perspective, whether or not they would even potentially broach the subject with their
Parents are their kids' first educators.
Yeah.
Right? And so if parents can, in fact, engage in those conversations earlier, right? Healthy, caring, loving conversations that are authentic, right? That are not meant to be superficial and or just deliberately contradictory of truths, right? Parents need to educate their kids on these truths. So I think it's important that, you know, and then, of course, when they enter schools, and you mentioned earlier that may be part of the conversation tonight, but it's important that parents actually begin that interrogation with their children.
See, and I have that Louisiana pragmatic crazy going on. Because when white parents ask me this, it's usually in an accusing tone. And I look at them and say, do you want your child to be able to hold a job? Because they don't know how to work with multicultural people, and they try to go to Minneapolis, Milwaukee, New York, LA. Eau Claire does not look like the rest of the world. And I know for a fact that some of these little kids here, now have to understand that I can speak as an educator about kids' development, but I'm speaking as a mother here.
Absolutely.
Until they're 16, they are uncivilized and occasionally crack-brained. And I know that these children are there, and I know they're in Eau Claire Public School, I know they're in Menominee, and I know they're in Chippewa. I know they're in Chippewa. They're in the hallways torturing other kids. Do you want your kid to be that kid?
Absolutely.
Because if your kid is that kid, you will deal with somebody like me. You really don't. You don't want to deal with somebody like me.
This is accurate.
This is absolutely accurate.
This is lived experience.
This is lived experience.
Right here. So that definitely happens. That's a real thing. So.
And then you got another angry parent up your tail. And then you've got a kid who now has a reputation. And you have a kid who may not be able to ride the bus, who may not be allowed into certain classes, can no longer do certain sports, because I will mess that up, okay? I will do this.
Yes.
Because if your kid is calling my kid the N-word, there will be consequences. Trust me, I am that person. And I'm the nice one. There are far harsher parents out here. So if you think race doesn't matter and you think racism is all a joke or there is no racism, understand this. If your kid gets out there and acts a fool, it can cost you your house under Title IX. It can cost you your savings. You can wind up needing a lawyer, and your kid can go to jail if some fists are swinging. So for your own protection, you need to teach your child how to behave around people who don't look like that child and that they are not superior to those people. Otherwise, they will be like the child, I'm going to embarrass my daughter here, who hit my child on the backside with a ruler, and my daughter went upside his head with an encyclopedia to try to beat some sense into him. Because that happens. That happens. And that kid called my daughter a racial name. Mm. Now, the thing is, as the parent of a multiracial child, I know my child will get in trouble if we engage in self-defense. I'm fully aware of that. That's why if it's a middle-class multiracial parent, they're probably lawyered up already. So you want your kid to know how to behave. Trust me on that.
So to take a step back, though, because as a father, what I really am hearing from all of you at this point is, and really, Rod, you said this earlier. I think actually it was Jaylin who said this, that you're doing a disservice to your children if you don't talk to them about race. I think that's beyond accurate. What I mean by that is I think you're actually crippling your child.
Absolutely.
If you don't talk about race.
In a number of ways.
Right. So talk about that. Like when you talk about a number of ways, what are you thinking?
Sure. I mean, I think it's like kind of piggybacking off of what you said too. Not only will your child be labeled as a bully, I think, or labeled as this person, like people don't forget that. I don't forget any experience that's ever happened to me ever. I remember every single person and like when it happened and who was around and who said something and who said nothing. So like not only do I remember that, but now as we move into our lives and we're all moving into different positions and work fields and workforces, that reputation is not going to go away. I am definitely a believer in forgiveness, and I want to believe people can change, but I won't forget that, and people won't forget that, and that reputation's going to stay.
It's traumatic.
So, absolutely.
Right.
And whether that's a job opportunity in the future, whether that's a romantic relationship in the future, the reality and the percentage chance of your child running into someone that is different from them in this world is 100%. And so if you don't have the tools to deal with that, let's say you're a manager someday and you don't have the tools, you don't have just like the basic, social cues and basic bare knowledge of different cultures, you're going to offend somebody. Like, it's just bound to happen. And also to learn that it's okay to offend if that happens, but what are the tools to handle that? And actually giving them the tools to say, you know what, I messed up. That was me. You're right. And how can we move forward from this? Because I think a lot of times what happens if you don't talk to these children about race, they're used to being a bully, and they're probably, if they're from Eau Claire, they're used to getting away with it. And there's going to come a time where they're not going to get away with it. And it immediately translates into defensiveness and trying to hide the fact that they may have these tendencies, or trying to suppress it, or blame, or not take personal responsibility, when really the whole way we all move forward is to take personal responsibility and admit when we do something wrong and when we don't know something. I think I respect people more than anything who can just say, I did not know, and I did not know, and that was my bad, and now I know, and this is how I'm going to change moving forward. And I think it's really just about that. It's okay to not know. It's okay to be a white person and not know everything about the Black experience. It's impossible to know everything about the Black experience. No one's asking you to do that. It's just a basic respect and basic knowledge of others and the people around you. So.
I would add to that. You know, you cannot affirm someone's humanity without having a sense of civility. And I think that's important for parents to understand, you know, of all races and cultures, right? You cannot affirm someone's humanity without instilling in our children, in others, this sense of civility. And I think what you're seeing, you know, even within the context of what's happening in our country today, is just this rampant and gross lack of civility, right? You know, and with that, with this lack of civility, you have this dehumanization that is rampantly occurring, right? And so, you know, there's this sense of unwillingness, if you will, you know, to listen to other people, right? To acknowledge their humanity, to validate, you know, that they too have lived experiences. And I think, you know, the earlier the kids learn that, right, the better. The better for our society, the better for this world. And I think, you know, it goes back to what the other panelists are saying too. It's just that those are different manifestations of that, right? And so what happens is, if they're not checked at an earlier age, then they grow up to become the bully who hits the biracial child on the rear end with a ruler, right? And so on and so forth, right? And so those things play themselves out circuitously over time, right? When we don't teach, we don't educate, right? So I think that's why it's important to teach kids, you know, at a very early age.
So, two things with that. We have a question from one of our community members I want to throw in, because it's great jumping right off of what you just said. But I think one of the things that we ought to consider is for parents who don't feel equipped to talk about race issues. You know, so for example, you have somebody who was raised in a home that never talked about race issues. And maybe you heard the N-word here and there, you know, growing up or whatever. But you want to lean into this, and you want to, we got to figure out, how do we help equip parents to have those conversations. And I know there's some resources out there, and that's probably another subject for another conversation. But yeah, we have a question from Tori Follett, from one of our community members. What recommendations do you have for talking to kids who are age 2 to 3 about race? Because you just talked about talking early, so.
Well, I think, yeah, that's a very nuanced age. I mean, cognitively, I don't know how much they would be able to understand, because they're really at that age dealing with issues more so that lend themselves to trust and mistrust.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say be careful what you're watching on the TV, and be careful what you're saying.
Absolutely. Good point.
Because they are tape recorders.
Yes.
They are sponges. And you
careful how you treat the service members at a restaurant.
Yes.
How you treat
Right. So, you know,
They will
absolutely.
imitate you.
Everything.
Absolutely.
They will imitate you. They will imitate how you treat people. And if you make a racial joke, or if you're allowing your relatives to make the racial joke, they're absorbing that.
Sure.
If I had $1 for the parents who've gone, I did not teach my child to say that. I did not let my child say that, da 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 da.
Yes.
There's an uncle somewhere,
That's right.
though, in the back who was saying
That's my
it all
lived
of a sudden.
experience.
Right.
And I'm like, well, yeah, but you let that go by.
Yeah.
And I'm black. I have to do the same thing with homophobia. I have to do the same thing with racism from some of my black relatives. My kids know that if somebody's saying something anti-Asian, or if they're saying it, if it's anti-white, or if it's anti-Latino or Native American, mama's going to stop it. And that is a value that they absorbed early. You got to start that.
It's about the
Early.
example, right? It's
Yeah,
about-
yeah, excellent point, you know, Dr. Duckworth.
Just call me Selika.
It's an excellent point because, you know, what I'm thinking is, so I'm thinking more developmentally, right? I'm kind of thinking about theories that are going through my head. And like I started talking about trust and mistrust, right? But there's a performance in this notion of trust and mistrust, right? Which speaks to what you're talking about, right? And so at that age, can we really have an intellectual conversation with a 2 and 3-year-old? Perhaps not, right? Not to the degree that we could with, you know, a teenager, so to speak. But as Selika was saying, you know, when we say certain things, right, or we let certain things occur in their presence, right, in their minds, right, that action, that behavior, that word becomes something that they can connect the sense of trust to, right?
Yep.
And so for them, it becomes affirming. These are the types of things that psychologically that are happening for them developmentally at that age, right? You know, and so it's an interesting notion. I mean, that's a good question that the guest asked. You know, so I would say, like my fellow panelists here, you know, be careful about, you know, the types of behaviors that you're engaging in and the types of narratives and discourses that you are allowing to permeate throughout your household. Because kids are sponges at that age. They're developing, you know, language, right? And that's why a lot of kids, you know, when they throw off the F word, so to speak, right? They just learned it. And so in that context, it's okay,
Yeah.
right?
Totally.
And mama was playing some song in the car
Right.
and did not realize that the kid was listening.
Right.
You know, and I mean, what brought that home to me, I had my son when he was a toddler in the car, and I was listening to Alicia Keys. She has a song where she's talking to you. He answered her back, like, oh, I better think about what I have in here.
Right.
And all of my 70s funk then just left the car. Because I started listening to the words. Well, no, I do not want to have this come back to me today.
I would add to that too, like other than just being careful and being on the defense of what you do, also be proactive and go seek out, you know, allow them to play with toys from other cultures, allow them to meet people from other cultures, have play dates with people from other cultures, take them to restaurants where the food isn't similar to your culture.
Yeah,
you know, have them, some of their new favorite things be things that aren't just only what you in your bubble of existence know. Try to get out there, because at the end of the day, I'm guessing most people have children to teach them about the world. Go teach them about the world. And that's a very easy thing to do. We have a really awesome community of, you know, and an awesome place to do that right here in Eau Claire. So that's what I would recommend too. I mean, if you can't have an intellectual conversation, you can definitely teach them about, you know, cuisine, toys, lifestyle, songs, music, anything like that.
It's an excellent point.
If I may, I'm going to sum up what everybody said. You know, influence is powerful. And I can't answer to 2 and 3-year-olds. Maybe my wife can, because she teaches 4-year-olds, but children watch and they listen. So influence is powerful. And when they get older, telling and controlling doesn't always work, but when they watch us, it's real powerful. And then I'll agree with Jaylin here, if we can expose them to anything different. It doesn't have to be racial or deal with gender or class, but anything different, just to expose them to anything, dissimilar to what they're used to. And
Get in the habit of experiencing
yes,
something.
and they'll watch us how we react to that difference. So I think that's powerful.
No, I agree. I agree. And the one thing y'all are gonna have to forgive me because I have a tendency to like be this big time reductionist where I take it back to this one simple thing. It's like, as a parent, just be a good person and like love your neighbor. And maybe like that's the best thing you can do for your 2 and 3 year old is to love your neighbor. I don't know.
Teach them not to bite.
Yeah, teach them not to bite. That's a good one.
I don't think there's nothing. I don't think there's anything reductionist about that at all. Yeah. You know, it's, like I say, it goes to this notion of one's humanity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that with the previous question, which I forget, but Selika, Jaylin, and Rod all answered that in a practical way.
Mm-hmm.
You mess with me, I'll mess with you. You know, sort of,
Right.
You'll pay for it down the road. You know, I think it's okay to talk about social understanding, trying to understand where someone else is coming from.
Yeah.
And then when they get a little bit older, get involved with civic engagement like Jaylin is now, and Selika and you, and then eventually social justice.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we live in a society when some of us are heavily marginalized and minoritized, and in some cases oppressed, even though there's laws to protect? Some of us are still oppressed.
Yeah, I think there's a natural progression there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're learning empathy as a child, and you then move into the civic engagement,
Right.
I would think the natural next step has to be concern about social justice.
Right.
Right? Like you're going to see people are being mistreated.
But some children move into that civic engagement quickly.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't think we can rule it out.
For
Well,
sure.
We want a beloved community. You know, this idea of that beloved community where everyone gets to figure out what they do best and gets to fit in and use all of their skills, and where we judge people on who they are. I think one of the mistakes, though, is that people assume that discrimination and racism are individual failings. And they don't teach their kids to look for ways that sometimes peer pressure systems and groups will create inequities. So to teach your child that to go below that surface, that because a group of, say, refugees are poor now, there is a structural reason for that. That does not mean that whole group is inferior. And that's something you really can, as you're talking to 2 and 3 year olds, 2-year-olds near when they get 3, they can understand that just because something looks different does not mean it is different. Just because something looks a certain way doesn't mean it is that way. Because I think we need to start teaching kids that savvy soon. I mean, I know I want that beloved community. I don't see that as a religious or a secular thing. I believe that as what we all work for.
That's a whole faulty division anyway.
It
That's
is.
Another conversation for another time.
Right.
We
got
can
a lot
go
of other
there.
Conversations for another time.
We can go there. I have somebody to come on, and I'm going to wear my body armor when it happens.
But we've got a couple of comments from audience members, and I want to share some of this with you. I think this is really insightful stuff. So first of all, studies have shown, this is from Mary Kay Ashley, studies have shown that infants at 6 months can tell differences in people, tell differences in people. What we tell our children from birth on matters. So, and then this one, I think this is a powerful one when it comes to 2 and 3 years old might be difficult, but like beyond that, I think would make sense. One way to introduce variant perspectives in an education setting can involve scrutinizing established revisionist history, pointing out the falsehoods believed for generations about Columbus, pilgrims and colonizers, westward expansion and manifest destiny, that kind of thing. That's from Ken Munson, one of our community members as well.
Sure.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
One way to approach this is we're a heavily racialized society, and that's been constructed. So we can deconstruct that. Let's take a look at it. And I think we can have conversations like that with our young children.
Absolutely.
Let's take a look at it.
I totally agree.
How did that start?
Yeah.
Let's look at it.
Yeah, my son's probably tired of those conversations, to be honest.
Okay.
So just to give you context, for those of you who don't know, my son is black, and he is, and so like that obviously adds nuance to all of this conversation for me personally as a white parent, a white dad of a black son. But that I love history. I feel feeble in my knowledge compared to some on this panel when it comes to history. But I really, I grew up studying the Civil War, growing up in Virginia, Civil War, Revolutionary War, all that stuff was big all the time. And so when I see a statue of a Confederate officer, or something like that comes up, the Confederate flag, for example, my son already knows what I'm gonna say about it before we get into it, And I think that's meaningful, though. I mean, I think it's to make a point like, okay, so this is here, this person thinks this is great, but let me tell you what the truth is behind this, or at least the truth as I understand it. I think that's a powerful thing.
We're going to have to, we as parents are going to have to supplement our kids' education. Just because, the frames of history have become so politicized. From some people, and the deep, when we look at the Department of Public Instruction, that is controlled by politics. So one of the things that we have to understand is we have to teach our kids. And as a historian, and I think Jerry can drive into this too, there have been certain frames we have been taught about race. There are certain narratives. And especially this idea of assimilation, which is a class narrative in many ways. And there's a set of stereotypes that are linked to race. I mean, if we can get our kids to challenge the assumption, get our kids to challenge the narrative. My daughter was asking me about Nobel Prize winners in chemistry and economics, and I was saying, well, is there anything that could stop me from doing it? And I'm like, yeah, you could do it. And that is what we want to get to for our kids. But to do that, we really have to challenge these stereotypes. And the kids catch the stereotypes so fast.
Yes.
By the age 4, they're already beginning to say those stereotypes, and we're going to have to be able to start challenging them.
That's right.
Right.
But for me, it's been the historical frames.
Right.
And this, I talk about some of what we're taught as history is actually U.S. fan fiction. It is, and it's not true. And they're taught it to little kids because they think little kids can't
It's specifically U.S. white rich fan fiction.
Yes.
Male white rich fan fiction.
And I think that we need to start thinking, even if your school is not teaching an accurate history, what you teach your kids is in many ways more important. And there are plenty of books, there's sites. I love Zen Education website. They actually have a free book you can take down and use. There's all sorts of sites. But the biggest thing is we have to, there are people who want to hook these stereotypes into our unconscious and into our comfortable confirmation bias. Teach them to interrogate, God, let me not use the word interrogate. I am not in a department meeting. Teach them to question when something's too comfortable. Because that's not just race, that's somebody trying to pick your pocket too, because they're going to flatter you and tell you what they want. Every con person tries to make you comfortable. And if they learn to do that for everything, including race, it'll help them navigate this world.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you said, and teaching, within public schools, if you want to help parents get to that level, right, you almost have to engage in teaching as a subversive activity.
Yeah, you can talk about that a little bit. You can't just stop there.
Well, what I mean is, so what you're talking about is a hidden curriculum, right? These concepts, these constructs, these ideas, right, that are not taught or that are, watered down, right? And so teachers then become the interlocutors of that process, right? Especially for teachers who genuinely care about, for example, social justice issues, right? They're going to do the additional research, right, to unpack, right, these narratives that are untold, that are hidden, right, that are misconstrued. But in that process, a lot of teachers are afraid to do that, right? Because there is such a thing as DPI, who are controlling their bodies and their work and so on and so forth, right? So there is a genuine, authentic fear, right? If I want to teach my kids the alternative narrative, right, and also help parents understand that, what risk am I putting my professionhood at, right, my livelihood, right? Mm-hmm. And so our educational system,
so let's go ahead and lean right in on that, because that's important.
Well, I'll finish this real quick, Jerry. Our educational system oftentimes doesn't support, right, that type of work, right, that type of subversive work. It is frowned upon, right? It is sanctioned, right? And so there's a whole lot to be said about that, but I'll let Jerry take over at this point.
Right. But I'm going to agree with all of you. Our public schools are underfunded. And social studies, that's what we're talking about here, is it's called curriculum narrowing. So in the elementary schools today in Eau Claire, I talked to a social studies professor, neighboring town, but it's similar, Eau Claire. I think it's 30 minutes twice a week for social studies education. Are you kidding me? So I like what Selika said with some supplemental teaching, but I think we also have to influence curiosity with our students, with our kids, with our children.
Yep.
And there's a lot of wonderful sites out there, the Library of Congress, National Archives, so many sites now for teaching. And I just want to throw that in. But we're being squeezed and we're underfunded.
Yeah.
And that's politicized.
Yep.
No Child Left Behind took history really out of that elementary school milieu. And when you look at it, I want to say it was 2008 or 2009 when the DPI finally mandated that high school students would learn about the civil rights movement. And there's a lot of schools that still don't make it to the civil rights movement today. It's kind of like the joke about the history teacher who never gets past the American Revolution because he's a football coach. You know, I teach history. I teach social studies ed teachers. Jerry teaches social studies ed teachers. They want to teach this, but you have a set of parents who really do want to tightly control the curriculum.
Yep.
And they don't want their kids to learn anything about race. They will throw a fit if the choir teacher teaches an African Noel. I mean, they are loud. So if you do want it in the schools, if you do expect your schools to teach an accurate history, you have to get involved with that school board and provide some cover for those teachers so that they can do that.
Yep.
You can't just put them out there to be roasted and toasted.
Which is the point that I was making. And I'm not a radical, guys. Don't when I say subversive activity.
We've already labeled you.
I'm not suggesting that I'm a radical, but what I am saying, it's just that it requires a risk.
Absolutely.
On behalf of many teachers who have this calling, right, to teach social justice-oriented curricula, right? But there is a risk oftentimes, a real tangible risk associated with that, right? And our systems don't make it easy for many teachers to do that.
Right.
So that's what I was getting at.
No, it makes total sense to me. And the irony of that for me is, and this is about as philosophical as I'm going to get at the moment, so y'all can tell me if I'm being stupid, but I think of education itself as subversive. So, like, it's the nature of education.
It depends on the education, though. It really depends, because some education is, how do I put this? 50% of my students are going to come in believing one way, and 50% will come in believing in another way. And those same 50% will probably go out doing the exact same thing.
Right.
I like to joke that those people who think that educators can indoctrinate or preach everything, they haven't been to a department meeting. They have definitely not been in the dean's office. And they just don't understand what actually happens in the classroom. So for me, and I'm saying this with a 20-year-old and a 13-year-old, there are certain things I expect the schools to do, but knowing the politicalization around it, I am just always aware I'm going to have to supplement. And if that means buying my kids the Moz graphic novel, the John L. Lewis graphic novel, Harlem Hellfighters, all of that stuff, that's what I'm going to do. Because I can neither rely on nor put those teachers in that position.
I feel like this touches on something you said earlier that I wanted to jump on in the moment when you said, like, oh, parents may not be equipped to teach their children about race. That's not really an excuse for me anymore. Like, that doesn't stand anymore, that you may just not know how. Learn how. Like, there's so much education. There's so many resources, whether it's podcasts. If you don't like to read, watch a documentary. If you don't like to watch TV, read a book. Like, read a website. There's so many different leaders, and I feel like I don't think that it's fair to, like you said, not only put teachers in that position, but also expect that your child's going to get everything they need from 1 hour or 30 minutes, as we're hearing, of social studies a week, and that you don't actually have to put any of that time, and you don't have to step out of any of your routines or your comfort zones in order to be able to give them that education that they literally need to succeed in the world. So I think I just wanted to touch on that earlier. If you know, like, when I hear that comment, I'm a white person or I'm a white parent that's just not quite equipped to deal with that. Well, no kid is equipped, 5-year-old kid is equipped to be called the N-word. Who equipped them? So I guess to me that just doesn't really stand anymore. So have these conversations, do the extra research. It could be 15 minutes a night.
Yeah.
Learn something you didn't know before.
And if I may, children don't want perfect parents, they want real parents. Or they don't want perfect teachers, they want real teachers. So take a chance, take a step off the cliff and have those conversations.
I'm gonna take a step back, and I'm gonna make this statement, and because when I talk about education being subversive, this gets back into doctrine and theology for me. So, we've talked about how, when a baby is born, the baby looks out for itself. That's what a child does. The child looks out for itself. The child is the center of its own world. And part of the educational process is recognizing, oh, there are other people. There are other priorities. There are other things to consider. So by nature, education is subversive because it's bucking against that natural inclination toward self. So I say that to say, when we have conversations with our kids that may feel uncomfortable because, like, it's just a tender subject or whatever, And I'll say, like, we try the best we can to lean in on those conversations with my son, but we are not as equipped as a black parent would be with the black experience, like you were talking about earlier, Jaylin. Like, I don't have that experience.
Absolutely.
There's a Koine Greek word, gnosko, which means to know by experience. And so, like, when you read in the New Testament, it talks about knowing God, knowing this, knowing that. It's gnosko. It's knowing through experience. It's not a head knowledge. I have some head knowledge about the black experience, but I have no gnosko knowledge of what it is to be black. And my son is learning that, you know, like at 3 years old when he had a kid that wouldn't play with him because his skin was brown. And he's been called the N-word several times at school and things like that. And so this education, like you said, we're going to be broken as we're doing it because we're broken anyway, right? Like we're frail. We don't see the whole picture. Yep. But having the courage to lean in on it even when you don't know the stuff, I think is really important.
Sure. It's risk. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to say it's risk taking.
Right.
Really.
Yeah, I think what I was just going to add to that too is like, you know, I'm obviously biracial. My dad is black, my mom is white. That's something that she also echoes, you know, like we've had so many conversations, and I think also recently some really productive ones where she's like, Jaylin, it doesn't matter how hard I try or study, I will never know what it feels like to be you. And I'm like, then all I need from you is to ask. Because I felt that was something that was missing a lot, is even if you don't know what it's like, just asking your child, what is it like to be you? Yeah. And when they give you answers, like also believing them. Because I think that there was a lot of times where I would try to explain something to someone in my family who was white that I'm like, this is what's happening. And they're like, oh no, Jaylin, it's just because you're so confident and you're so outspoken and you're you know, because you're a tall woman. And I'm like, no, it's not because of that. Like, it's because of these very, very specific ingrained like systems in our society and also in our social systems that are happening every day. And so I think even just that relief for someone to ask what it felt like to be me for one day and to believe me was all that I really, just to be heard on that, because it was, that was huge for me. So when we started having those dialogues, I think everything changed for me.
When your kid is not the same race as you. Also when your kid is not the same color as you, because my son was passé blanc, passe for white, until he was about 16. When it's not summer, he still is very, very light-skinned. People would ask me if I was his nanny. And he's a throwback. He's a throwback. To understand that if I invalidate his experience, I am increasing the cognitive load that being a young black man in America already puts on him. For if you're a white parent of a child who is not your race, you have to understand race is a cognitive load. Racial stereotypes are class stereotypes. Those same stereotypes will be class-based for whites, but they're applying a lower class stereotype to all blacks or all Latino or all Hmong, no, regardless of what our class is. But every multicultural person who is successful in this world, who's trying to navigate this world, and is living in a community that is not the majority of their skin color, has to be hyper aware of covert racism. And that starts with kids 4, 5, and 6. That hyper-awareness is called Stereotype Threat. So if you're interested, Charles Steele, Whistling Vivaldi is the best book out there. There's a bunch of articles.
We should maybe do a show about racial stereotypes.
We should.
And it's on the docket, actually.
It is on the docket. but what I'm saying here is that your kid already has this cognitive load, this additional bag of rocks to bear. When you invalidate it because the idea that somebody is doing something to your kid because of race, you've just added to that cognitive load. You get to the point, if you're a marginalized person in this country, doesn't matter what kind of marginality it is, you become hyper aware of what the marginality is. That can be sexuality, that can be trans, etc. And you see the micro expressions that go across people's faces. You know, this is how we can tell somebody doesn't like us. You know, it's like, I know that dude doesn't like me. How? What did he say? I don't know, but I know.
Yeah.
It's the micro expressions of disgust. It's the micro expressions that go. It's the body language. It's the tone. It's the, you're not wearing that. We know all of this. It's all of that. But the problem is, it's also plausible deniability if you're a passive-aggressive abuser. And that's not just race. Passive-aggressive abuser goes everywhere, to the academics, to the boardroom, to the middle school, to the school bus. And the biggest thing you can do as a parent is not say, oh, it's not race. Or if you're in an interracial relationship and your spouse or partner comes home and says, oh, this happened and I think it was race. Oh, that wasn't race. Are you serious?
Right.
You know?
Right.
You're adding to that cognitive load. And people don't realize that race is a cognitive load. It causes cortisone. And that's why, for instance, black men who have one of the most horrific stereotypes placed on them die sooner.
Yep.
Heart attacks, liver issues, cancer comes from cortisol load.
Yep.
For black women, more aggressive breast cancers, heart attacks. I can go through Latino, I can go to Native American. Native American men and black men are like one-on-one with cognitive load from stereotyping and all the stress it takes to sort of preemptively strike.
Can I add to that? Because so I work for, when I'm not rabble rousing with you, I work for a health and wellness company, and we have these 4 principles. It's kind of like health coaching. It's not quite the same, but we have these 4 principles. One of them is the mind-body connection, and how the mind and the body are connected, and what you think impacts how you feel. And when you talk about the cognitive load, that my mind, because my mind does that, it goes right to this connect. Oh yeah, that's what we talk about at work all the time. And so when you start like extrapolating that out to marginalized people, people who have been oppressed, people, you know, who have experienced cyclical poverty, generational poverty, things like that. I think that helps to fill out the picture a little bit of what we're really up against with these things and why this education is so important. And in light of that, we have a question that I want to share from one of our, actually she's not a community member, she's one of our teammates. This is from Shanglor Waldinger, who has the Social Exchange Project podcast, and she's magnificent. I'm gonna stop talking nice about her now, so she's not embarrassed. But her question is, how do you teach your multicultural children good coping skills and confidence when they've experienced racism and discrimination themselves? So we talk about the cognitive load. We're talking about what it's like when your kid sees the microaggressions at day camp and comes home and doesn't know why somebody doesn't like them, but they do. So what do we do to restore, to heal, to guide them?
I have to, with my kids, I teach them how to talk across race, because talking across race is a skill. We don't think of it as a skill, but it is a skill. Because if you don't talk across race in a pretty specific manner, people shut down and they don't hear you. So for instance, with bullying, I tell them, you know, with racialized bullying, I tell them to start by talking to the teacher about bullying, period. Because white people know that bullying has a cognitive load. If you've been bullied, that cognitive load, you're fearing going to school, et cetera, they understand that. So you've got to start them there and move them to here. But you have to describe it in a certain way in order to get help. And you have to know how to work this system. So there's a practical, how do you get it to stop? But the other part is, well, why do they hate me? And I'll tell you, that one starts in 1st and 2nd grade, still recovering, still dealing with it. And it won't just be race. It's going to be, it's Huda Day, so I'm going to be evil.
Right.
You know, and when they get to be like 9, 10, 11, then they get moody and irrational. That's a whole nother animal. And sometimes you have to say, this isn't really about you. I mean, sometimes if the little kid is acted like you need to go and apologize. They had a reason to be mad at you. Let's not just think it's always about race. But if it's not, or if they're saying it's about race, this isn't about you, they're not the friend you thought they were. And one of the most important things we have to do is teach them let them work through the cognitive load, because they're going to have to work through it.
Yeah.
It's going to take a little bit for them to work through the anger and the hurt and the fear.
Yep.
We always want to, I think the mistake that my community has always made, he knows exactly what I'm about to say. It's those parents that, what you crying about here? I'll give you something to cry about. You know, you need to be happy, or that's not important. You know, we don't let kids work through their emotions. But it really hurts to be betrayed by somebody you thought was your friend.
Yes.
And to tell them, give them the language saying, this is a betrayal, this is a person you can't trust. Even if they came back, can you trust them again?
Right.
Right.
And that is,
Yeah.
it's one of the hardest things you do as a parent. It hurts. It hurts your heart. It really does.
Yeah. What you said to me, I mean, perhaps the most powerful thing you said to me is arming kids with the language to navigate those difficult places. Because as parents, oftentimes we want to just jump right in and be their savior, right? We want to come across as this messianic figure, right? But we have to understand that, for one, being, you know, a minoritized individual, right? There's much of the cognitive load that we're just going to naturally deal with, have to bear. But then we have to understand how to work through that constructively, right? And therein lies the rub. And I think the sooner we arm our kids to be able to talk through, you mentioned this earlier, those issues, give them the language, right, to be able to seek out help, assistance, right, to be able to communicate with their friends or former friends, what have you. I think you're teaching them a valuable tool, right? You're teaching them a valuable tool because it disrupts, right? It disrupts those dialogue and those conversations that people may naturally want to have with them, but they have the language to push back, right? And I'm not saying, you know, language that is meant to be negative or averse, so to speak, but language that is meant to be, you know, intuitive, constructive, proactive, right? That is probably the best thing that we can do to help kids cope and deal with those issues.
Yeah. Rod, we call it academic language. It really is, you know, in a non-hurtful way.
Right.
Come back with a question. You know.
Because, yeah, I mean, and, you know, and I think just parents, just having those continuous conversations. You know, my wife is good at that. She's better than I am at it. You know, I'm married to a white woman, you know, and my daughter, she's 3. And sometimes, you know, she says the little things, and so my wife immediately go into this Q&A with her, this dialogic process with her, right? She's early childhood, so she understands it better than I do. I just listen and I'm in awe, right? Because, you know, she's breaking it down for her in such a way that my daughter is able to then turn around and use it constructively, right? Valuable tool. And I think that's one of the best ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
I think the first thing you have to say to them, and your wife probably does this, is you don't deserve this.
That wasn't right.
She says that all the time.
Yep.
That wasn't right. You don't deserve this.
But also that did happen.
It
Right.
did
What
happen.
happened was real,
Right.
Yes.
but
This
it doesn't
is real.
define you.
They don't get to define you.
Yeah.
And at least, you know, and you have to be careful. A lot of people want to say, at least you're learning now. You can't minimize their pain.
Sure.
Right.
But to let them know that not every friend you have now is going to be with you when,
Had that one really early on.
Yeah.
That
you know, speaking honestly to your kids about the friends you've left behind helps. That you've had to leave some behind, that you don't tolerate certain behavior. You have to teach your kid not to tolerate certain behavior in order to fit in.
And to strengthen them.
To strengthen them.
Absolutely.
Well, especially, we are in a hyper-white city. And here, I'm going to be quoting from the Fegan book, Two-Faced Racism, Backstage, Whites in the Backstage. There are going to be times when they're the only one in the room, or when there's two.
That will be the majority of the time.
And there will be bullies who are trying to exert power against them, not because they did anything wrong, but because they're two, they're easy to scapegoat. You know, so they'll want to call them the N-word or try to get them to agree that someone is or something like that. They want to come up and act up. They need to know how to hold their ground without getting in trouble with the school authorities.
Yep.
And this is the hard one. And that may mean you're repeating the same thing over and over again. Don't call me that. I'm not that. Don't do this. I mean, we had a problem here. I want to say it was 2002 or 3, where we had young white men were going up to young black men in the bars and going, "What's up, my," and then getting hit. And the Eau Claire police and the university police came to me and said, "Would you teach them not to do this?" Because I'm an academic, I went and I got the first chapter from Randall Kennedy's book, N-word. I constructed a thing around it. We would have a discussion in class. And I just finally boiled it down to telling the white kids, you do not have an N-word pass. There is no pass. You don't get a black pass. If somebody gives you a black pass, it's not transferable. You're going to get hit. You know, because the exercise was too much. Sometimes you just got to tell people not to act that way.
Sure.
But, you know, you also have to tell your kids have to learn who their friends are, who their posse is, and what their identity is, what their strength is.
Right.
You know, and that's where how we carry ourselves. If we're always worried about what somebody thinks about us, they'll pick that up. We have to teach them that inner strength.
Sure.
And maybe 4-7-8 breathing so that they don't punch anybody out. I mean, I had to stop joking and saying violence is the answer because I did not want my kids to pick that up. Now, I might believe it, but I don't want my kids to actually go and enact that, and then I've got to bail them out of jail. So I had to stop saying that.
True.
Right.
What were you going to say, Jaylin?
I was just going to say, I obviously don't have any kids. Hopefully that stays that way for a while. Not ready. But as someone who I guess is a young adult and who I guess recently within the last 10 years have kind of dealt with all this.
Yeah, you're the closest to a child.
You're the closest to it.
The baby. Yeah.
You're not a baby.
No.
But yeah, I guess I do a lot of practice just like for my own because I think I've had a lot of these emotions internalized and just pushed down for so long that they have kind of come out in my early adulthood and time for me to heal them. So I do a lot of work like practicing talking to my inner child. And I think that it's kind of, you know, doing that work of what would you need to hear at that time when your kid comes home with those problems and what would you need to hear. And so I guess like for me, what would have been nice for me to hear was that that happened, you're valid, that everything that you felt was real. It doesn't define you. And kind of going on back to what you said is that not only does it not define you, but each person and this earth is walking around with stuff that you don't even know what they're carrying and you don't know why they let it out on you, but that doesn't belong to you. It never did. That belongs to them, whatever was said. And so I just need you to know that you may have taken on some of that burden today, but that's not yours to carry, so you can leave it there. And number two, for me, I just watched the Michelle Obama documentary, and it was incredible. And I think she's talking to a group of high school women, and they ask, you know, how can we be seen in this world that refuses to see us? And she said, you can't wait for people to see you. We don't have time for you to wait for people to see you. There are people with these agendas, and that's what they think. You need to find that inside yourself. Right. How can we nurture what you have because you're perfect the way you are, and everything that is coming to you at this moment, every experience that you've been through, and also this complex situation of your skin color, it's meant for a reason, and it's going to help you later down the road. And even though you can't see it now, it's gonna serve such a rich purpose and give you so much perspective in the future that, like, please don't pick this up here, leave that there, and let's keep going, and it's going to build resilience even if you can't see what for now.
Just a quick, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, if I could just sum up what Selika and Jaylin and Rod said, they all three have their own phraseologies to deal with. You have one-liners that you tell yourself, or you might tell other people, to position that hurt. For Shang, you could say, incomplete people will try to make you incomplete as well, or unhappy people will try to make you unhappy as well.
Sure.
That's not you. So what I would say, or what I would do is, have them craft or learn new phraseologies to help in those situations. So I just want to throw that in.
Yeah.
I think
because you're all using them.
We are. Scripts are really important.
Yeah.
And,
Scripts, yeah.
And it has to be one sentence and it has to be short.
Yep.
People want kids to go into this giant Shakespearean diatribe. Nobody's going to wait for that, but, to teach them how not to be contagiously mean, because mean is contagious. And when it's racist...
And it's easy.
It's easy.
Being mean is easy.
And when it's racist is when it's easiest to justify. So you've got two issues going on here. One is to help them deal with their pain, and the other is to help them not to be a pain giver in response. And that can be looking at them and saying, so why did you say that to me? Or what are you trying to get? Or I hope that made you feel better. Or you must be in a whole lot of pain to say that. Because your temptation is to say something ugly to them, like, and your mama too. Because that's kids.
Yeah.
But to help to teach them the calmness and the dignity, which sounds like respectability politics, and that's hard. We don't.
No, this is different.
Right.
This is subversive. This is you're disrupting the normal rhythm of an eye for an eye, and you're saying, I'm going to return good for evil.
I'm calling it verbal jujitsu.
Right.
With my kids. My husband calls it verbal aikido because you're taking the energy and you're moving it in a different way. And he's actually really good at this. The other thing that you can teach them to do, if somebody says something ugly, you answer with a non sequitur. And, because that will drive them absolutely.
What's an example? Give us an example.
Oh, if somebody said, why do you blacks da 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 da? And I'm like, I will pray for you. I hope you're having a better day. Is there something I can do to help you with this problem?
Right.
And it's part of agency. I've done this to people, and I'm very lucky they haven't swung on me, but they're afraid I'll swing back. And I would suggest never doing this in Academic Policies Committee or in University Senate, and I have done both. But, one-liner scripts that help you to feel like you have agency.
Right.
And to keep them from what they want, which is hurting you. I know it's coming because it's been screamed at me out of passing cars, but I know somebody's going to jump in my face and call me the N-word because it's the environment we were in. So I've been practicing, okay, what am I going to say? Is that all you got? I'm going to pray for you.
Right.
Referee flag on play. Name calling, 100 yards, back it up. So I'm practicing it, and I have a couple of allies I'm practicing this with so that
you're ready.
When it happens, I will be able to keep my dignity and not cuss them out.
Yeah.
Which is what we're trying for here. And to teach my kids that, and again, it sounds like respectability politics, but ultimately, we always want to be in control of ourselves, and what makes us feel bad is to not be in control of ourselves. So the one-liners, and to practice that, and I've said when I get time, God knows when I'll get time, I want to write a whole bunch of one-line answers to the in real life trolls we have about race. and just put them there. But I mean, for me, that works. Right. And telling my kids, no, I will cut you is not the right response. It is the one you want. It is not the right response.
Right. I have a thought in mind, but I know, Rod, you had something.
No, I was going to be real quick. In thinking about, this conversation that we're having about, the empowerment of using words to help kids, learn how to cope, right, and deal with issues that come up. And I was thinking about the reason why this is so powerful as well is that when kids get to the point of adolescence, right, they're dealing with this identity versus role confusion, right? They're trying to navigate that space, right? Their sense of identity, what role do they play in life, within their family, outside of their families, friends, so on and so forth. And then when they get beyond that stage, right, they go into young adulthood, and then it becomes one of, intimacy versus isolation, right? And that's where you see, a lot of times, you wonder why, young adults get in such terrible relationships, right? They may not want to be by themselves, right? And so they're cleaving to something or someone, right, that's going to affirm them, right? And that's why it's so important, as parents, along the way, right, we're equipping our kids through these conversations that constantly validate their experiences and reaffirm who they are as a human being, regardless of race, culture, ethnicity, what have you, right? But of course, those conversations become more nuanced, right, when you're minoritized. But, this is why it's so important to have these types of conversations, and even this forum, right, to help educate, the broader community.
So we've talked, and we don't have time to unpack this tonight because, believe it or not, it's 8 minutes to 9.
Oh, wow.
So
I was fast.
That was fast.
That was fast.
One of the things I'm thinking about, because we touched on this really briefly, but when we talked about children, this was in response to Sheng's question about how do we help children who have experienced discrimination or whatever, like to take the next step, and so we've talked a lot about that response, the scripting and that kind of thing, and the empowerment of language and things like that. But one of the thing that we touched very briefly on that I think is really important is the idea of handling trauma and walking through trauma.
Yes.
And so we don't have time to talk about that tonight in any kind of detail, but I will tell you that that's something that we want to talk about in this series eventually. My friend Willie McCaleb, who works in the local school system here, I think he also does special education. He and I just were talking recently, and that it just came like just flowing out of him, like black men just don't have space. They don't create space to just feel stuff and to, walk through trauma. And it's not just black men. I mean,
men in general.
A lot of us don't want to. People really don't want to deal with the hard stuff,
Right.
They can really go deep on stuff. And when I think of, I use this example during the Juneteenth deal. I experienced a very mild form of sexual abuse when I was about 8 to 10 years old. That messed me up for like 20 years. And it took a long time before I was willing to really take a look at it and walk into it and find healing. That was minor. We have black folks who, their ancestors were brought here as slaves and their culture was ripped away from them. And they've been stuck in this underclass, even though people don't want to call it that, an underclass forever in American history. We have Hmong people here in the Chippewa Valley who, like, this place would not be the same without our Hmong population. That's part of what I love about this place. But when they came here, after helping the U.S. in the Vietnamese War, they were discriminated against and people didn't want them here. We have, Latinos who, are judged by the highest levels of our government right now because of their skin and where they come from, and those are generational things that just keep happening over and over again. And I think about all that trauma that is just built up and built up and built up, and that's something that I think we really need to lean in hard on. Is how do we process that kind of trauma with people?
Yeah.
But I think we also need to process how the gender influences the trauma.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Because Native American men and African American men in this country have been absolutely terrorized.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at what happens. A black man who is just standing there can be falsely accused and have the police called on him and just be destroyed. A Native American man can do the same. There are Native American men right now who have been hit by cars deliberately when we're talking about the pipeline protests. There are people who are making fun. This whole thing with the Washington Redskins has really brought that up.
You mean the Washington football team?
Well, I'm going to call them the Washington Gridlock because I've driven there and I know what that looks like. They thought it was okay to call them a slur.
Yep.
And that is for men, I really do think, for all men, we don't have a way to allow them to undo the trauma. I think that one of the prices of the American vision of manhood is that early death, because of the pain, the cognitive load that comes from this stoicism we want.
Yeah.
But for black men and for Native men, you add to that just by breathing, they can be seen as a threat. So they have to do all these additional steps and know that those additional steps may not save them.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, as a black woman, I can have that happen to me too, but it's going to happen at a lower rate. Yep. So it's really, that terrorization, I think, is something we have to talk. And I saw Jerry. I saw you.
Yeah, we got to. Can you give us something brief?
Jump in.
Real brief.
Jump in.
That's called internalized depression.
Yes.
You know, they can't express and it stays in. Male being male, man. We deal with it in the wrong way.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it. But to be a person of color is going to a million times worse.
Yeah.
So internalized oppression.
Yeah.
And
So-
internalized self-hatred.
Yep. For being black.
So normally I'm going to have you do a closing statement, but we don't have time for all that because we had such a robust conversation. I want to thank you all for doing this tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
So Selika, thank you as always. I am jealous of your knowledge of history and general coolness. Jaylin, thank you so much. I'm very jealous of your hair because it's not going to last much longer. Rod, I'm jealous of your vocabulary, man. I've just been sitting here marveling at your vocabulary and wishing I could have that vocabulary.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to work on it, though. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Jerry, that's the best answer to the pro wrestling nickname question I've ever heard.
Big Sky.
Big
Awesome.
Sky.
Big Sky.
So I'm digging that.
Yeah.
I really am.
I could have gone Treasure State, but Big Sky.
I think Big Sky's better. I like that. I like that. There's a little. It's nice, but there's a little intimidation in that.
Yeah.
So, well, and I also want to thank you guys and thank Pablo Center for being such a great partner with this thing. AJ has been great today. Jason Anderson, the whole group has been fantastic.
Adam
Acola from
Adam.
CoLab is helping us make this happen. Shang is here as an observer tonight, but she's going to be helping us out with these shows going forward. Converge Radio, Uniting Bridges. So we want to leave each of these sessions with kind of a call to action. And so while we don't have this concrete thing to lay out for anybody, I will say if you go into the chat function or the chat area in the live stream, you'll see some resources listed there that we've referred to. Thank you, Adam, for making that happen. Some references today. And I do want to say, too, we had Jessica Zeman, one of our, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your last name, one of our community members who messaged in and asked about, for future conversations, would we be including other groups such as Hmong and Latinos, indigenous peoples? Yes, 100%. So thank you for asking that question. But thanks to everybody for doing this. Next week, we're diving into the idea of defunding the police and what is that all about? And that's got a lot of baggage, and how can we walk through that a little bit? So thank you so much, and join us again next week at 7:30 on the Pablo's streaming site and on Converge Radio.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.